Jackson Browning always treasured the precious minutes he spent in his backyard after a grueling workday. Nestled behind his modest suburban home, that backyard had become his personal haven, a place where he could escape the ceaseless rush of city life and simply breathe. With neatly trimmed hedges, a thriving garden plot of strawberries, and a few flowering hibiscus plants, the yard was more than an outdoor area, it was a sanctuary that reflected Jackson's personality, calm on the surface yet vibrant at its core. On most weekdays, he found himself surrounded by spreadsheets and tight deadlines at the office. By the time he returned home, his mind often buzzed with figures and tasks waiting to be tackled the next morning. However, one of his long-standing rituals helped him cope with the mental strain, spending 30 minutes to an hour on his patio, sipping a tall glass of iced tea while allowing his thoughts to settle. That ritual had come to symbolize freedom, an unspoken promise to himself that after the hustle, there was always tranquility to be found in his own backyard. That particular Friday, Jackson felt more exhausted than usual. The final project of the quarter had consumed his entire week, and all he wanted was to slip into a pair of comfortable shorts and lounge beside his private swimming pool. Many of his neighbors preferred community amenities or frequent trips to public recreation centers, but Jackson had saved diligently for years to install a modest pool just behind his house. It wasn't extravagant by any means, only about 20 feet long and 6 feet deep at its deepest end, but it was his. This, he believed, was the perfect setting to wash away the stress of the day. He found nothing more rewarding than floating on his back, staring up at the sky, and letting his troubles drift away beneath the water's surface. After changing out of his office attire, Jackson grabbed his favorite paperback. An old mystery novel he'd been trying to finish for weeks, and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun blanketed the yard in a warm glow. A soft breeze stirred the leaves of the tall elm tree near the back fence, and the scent of rosemary from his small herb planter mingled pleasantly with the hint of chlorine in the air. He closed his eyes, taking a moment to absorb the calm atmosphere. The world felt quiet and still, at least for a moment. But just as Jackson was about to settle onto a comfortable chaise lounge, a metallic clank startled him. He opened his eyes to see that the side gate, an old iron door he usually kept locked, had swung open. At first, confusion held him in place. Perhaps it was the wind, he thought, or maybe he hadn't latched it properly. Yet, the distinct sound suggested someone had deliberately lifted the latch. Alarmed and curious, Jackson set down his paperback and stood up, heart pounding with a mix of unease and puzzlement. Little did he know that this unexpected intrusion would mark the beginning of an ordeal he could never have anticipated, one that would test his patience, challenge his sense of security, and ultimately alter his perspective on the sanctity of his own home. What do you think? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories like this. No sooner had Jackson taken a step toward the gate than a woman he had never seen before appeared, her posture rigid and her expression unmistakably agitated. She wore a blouse in a vibrant shade of pink, and her hair was pulled back into a severe ponytail that highlighted the scowl on her face. Trailing behind her was a boy who looked to be around 8 years old, clutching a small action figure in one hand. "Hey!" Jackson called out, keeping his tone even but firm. "This is private property. Are you lost?" The woman, whose name he would soon learn was Adele, did not bother with greetings or apologies. Instead, she jabbed a finger toward the pool. "That thing almost drowned my son," she exclaimed, her voice echoing off the wooden fence. The boy, Colton, clung to her side but seemed more interested in his toy than whatever accusation his mother was making. Jackson blinked, briefly glancing between Adele, the boy, and the pool. He couldn't recall ever seeing them in the neighborhood. Most families who lived nearby were friendly or at least aware of one another. While Jackson did keep to himself, he had never encountered someone marching straight into his backyard as though they owned it. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here," he said, taking a step closer to the intruders. Despite the annoyance welling up inside him, he tried to maintain a level of composure. "I'm sorry if there was any confusion, but this is off limits to the public." Adele's eyes flared with indignation. Don't tell me about what's off limits. My son nearly fell into that death trap of yours. Her voice grew shrill, and she tugged Colton closer as though the child was in imminent danger. You think it's okay to have a 6-foot-deep pool with no warnings? And no lifeguard? Jackson raised an eyebrow, feeling the tension mount in his chest. He made an effort to keep his voice calm, though it trembled slightly with restrained frustration. I have a sign posted on the fence, he said, motioning to a clearly visible marker that read, Private Pool, No Trespassing. There are also depth markers on the edge, clearly showing the water level. Besides, you shouldn't be inside my yard without my permission. Before he could continue, Adele stomped forward, pointing accusingly at the water's shimmering surface. My boy could have drowned if I hadn't pulled him away in time. This entire setup is irresponsible. You need to fix it. Jackson's thoughts whirled as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. The pool gate was locked whenever he wasn't using it, he double-checked it as a matter of routine. Additionally, local regulations required him to meet specific safety standards, and he had complied with every single one when the pool was installed. There was a self-latching gate, a secure fence at least 4 feet high around the perimeter, and posted depth warnings. How could anyone possibly wander in here on a whim? Yet, here stood Adele, brazenly blaming him for an alleged near accident. Colton glanced at the pool, seemingly unfazed by the commotion, his attention more absorbed by whatever imaginary battle his action figure was waging. Ma'am, Jackson began again, doing his best to conceal his irritation, I'm sorry your son felt scared, but you both need to leave. This is trespassing. Adele scoffed, arms crossed, eyes narrowing into slits of contempt. I'm not going anywhere until you promise to fix that menace you call a pool. Jackson clenched his fists discreetly, taking in a slow breath to steady himself. He had always been proud of his meticulously maintained private swimming pool. After all, he had adhered to every city code, installed the correct safety features, and double-checked that the gate latched securely. The last thing he expected was to be ambushed by a stranger who not only trespassed but also hurled baseless accusations at him. Still standing near the edge of the pool, he fixed Adele with a firm stare. Listen, he began, each syllable measured to keep his frustration under control. I have followed all the safety regulations mandated by our local authorities. The pool gate is always locked when I'm not out here, and there are signs posted. It's not my fault if you or your son wandered in through an unlocked gate. Adele's nostrils flared. She didn't seem remotely interested in hearing an explanation. Her stance was that of someone who believed she was unquestionably in the right. My child's safety was in jeopardy. That's on you, she spat. She was shaking either from anger or a twisted sense of self-righteousness. Jackson felt a pang of sympathy for the young boy, Colton, who was practically hiding behind his mother. Although the child's eyes darted around the yard, he appeared more curious than frightened. Jackson couldn't help but wonder if Adele truly believed in the danger she claimed or if this was some misguided attempt to shift blame. Whatever the case, he couldn't allow such an intrusion to go unquestioned. Stepping a bit closer, Jackson pointed to a large sign near the gate. It's right there, in bold letters. It says, No trespassing, private property. And here, he said, motioning to the metal plaque near the pool's shallow end, you can see the water depth. There's another sign that clearly states, children must be supervised at all times. I've complied with every regulation from the county inspector. He spoke each phrase calmly, trying to inject logic into a situation that felt increasingly irrational. His words, however, seemed to fuel Adele's indignation. She crossed her arms tightly. Don't patronize me. It's not about your silly signs. What if my child can't read them yet? You think that's enough to keep him safe? Her voice rose, teetering on the edge of a full-blown tirade. You need to fill in that deep end. It's almost 6 feet, way too deep for a small yard. Jackson inhaled slowly, grappling with the anger that threatened to spill out. Part of him wanted to shout back, to demand she leave immediately, but he knew better than to escalate the conflict. Instead, he tried once more to reason with her. "Adele, is it? I understand you're worried about Colton, but the truth remains, you and your son are on my property without permission. If you had any concerns, the right thing to do would have been to talk to me at the front door, not sneak into my backyard uninvited." Adele scoffed, turning her head away as though the very act of acknowledging him was beneath her. "Do you think I have time to go knocking on doors? My son told me he saw a pool and wanted to take a closer look. I followed him in, and I see now how dangerous it is. I'm telling you, either fix that hazard or I'll see to it you're held responsible." Jackson's jaw tightened. He had never encountered someone so brazen in their demands, especially when they were entirely in the wrong. The emotional tug-of-war inside him was fierce. On the one hand, he didn't want to be dismissive of a mother's fear for her child's safety. On the other, he bristled at the sheer gall it took to break into someone's yard and hurl accusations without any sense of wrongdoing. He decided to state his position plainly, in hopes that logic might prevail. "I'm sorry your son felt uneasy or frightened, but Colton wouldn't be in any danger if he stayed outside my yard. My fence is built to code, the warnings are clearly posted, and the water depth is entirely legal. The pool was installed under strict guidelines, and I have the paperwork to prove it." For a moment, Adele said nothing, her chest heaving with barely contained rage. She seemed torn between storming off and continuing to argue. Finally, she jabbed a finger at Jackson's chest. "I won't let this go. If I have to take this to the authorities, I will. People like you don't deserve to own pools if you can't make them safe." Jackson felt an undercurrent of panic surge through him. He didn't know where this might lead, but he understood that once authorities got involved, the conversation could spiral out of his control. As much as he wanted to keep peace in his neighborhood, he also recognized that appeasing Adele's outrageous demands was impossible. He locked eyes with her, voice low but resolute. "If you truly believe you have a claim, then go ahead and report it. But I'll defend my property and my rights. Now, please, leave." Rather than retreat, Adele leveled one last glare at him. She turned on her heel, calling Colton to follow, and marched toward the gate. Her parting words rang out in the otherwise serene yard, "You'll be sorry you messed with me." In the aftermath of Adele's threat, Jackson stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding as he tried to reconcile the surreal confrontation that had just unfolded. A few minutes earlier, he had been looking forward to sinking into a comfy chair with his mystery novel. Now, his sanctuary felt violated, the sense of peace replaced by a swirling mix of anger and worry. He watched as Adele stormed out of the gate, Colton scampering behind her in confusion. The latch clicked loudly as the metal door slammed shut behind them. Jackson took a moment to calm himself, exhaling slowly as he tried to reassess. He scanned the fence line, noticing it was still secure apart from the gate Adele had forced open. He moved toward it to inspect the latch. It appeared intact, though not as sturdy as he'd like. He made a mental note to add a secondary lock or perhaps install a more robust system. The idea that anyone could walk in at any time now felt alarmingly real. Returning to the poolside, he gathered up his paperback and set it on a small side table. His legs felt a bit shaky, and his emotions churned. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the encounter, but a far stronger part trembled with the fear that Adele might actually try to follow through on her threats. After all, he had heard stories of frivolous lawsuits and the havoc they could wreak on unsuspecting homeowners. Sighing, Jackson sat down on the chaise lounge, stared at the glittering water, and tried to piece together what might come next. 10 minutes later, just as he began to feel a small measure of calm return, the distant wail of sirens snapped his attention back to reality. The blare grew louder, and sure enough, a patrol car rolled up along the curb in front of his house. 2 police officers, uniforms crisp under the sun, stepped out and made their way toward the side gate. Jackson's stomach knotted. He rose from the chaise lounge, feeling strangely lightheaded as adrenaline spiked again. The first officer, whose nameplate read Greenwood, peered over the gate. Jackson approached, lifting his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. Greenwood's partner, Officer Reynolds, stood a few steps behind, eyes shifting from side to side as if scanning for potential threats. "Good afternoon," Jackson said, his voice uncertain. "I'm guessing you're here because someone called you?" Officer Greenwood nodded curtly. "We received a report of a disturbance and possible reckless behavior involving a child." Jackson's jaw clenched. Despite knowing he had done nothing wrong, he felt an unsettling wave of anxiety. "I'm sure that was Adele," he replied, stepping aside to let the officers into the yard. "She and her son were here without my permission. She started yelling about my pool being dangerous." Greenwood passed through the gate, eyeing the yard. Reynolds followed, stepping with caution. "We'll need to hear both sides of this," Greenwood said. "We got a call from a concerned mother who said her child nearly drowned and that you refused to address the issue." Jackson struggled to keep his composure, forcing down the frustration that threatened to surface. "That's not exactly how it happened," he explained. "They came in here uninvited. My gate was locked before, and I believe she forced it open. My pool has the proper signage and meets all local safety codes. There's no way her son was in any real danger if she'd been supervising him." Officer Reynolds jotted down some notes, casting a measured look around the property. "Do you mind if we ask where the boy went under, or nearly under?" Jackson sighed, gesturing to the pool. "She claims he almost drowned, but the boy never even touched the water in my presence. He was walking around with a toy when I saw him. I tried to reason with Adele that they were trespassing, and that's when she started threatening me. Next thing I know, she stormed off and said she was calling the police." Greenwood exchanged a glance with his partner, then turned back to Jackson. "She alleged you ignored safety protocols, and that the pool was uncovered and unguarded. She also said you were confrontational, refused to acknowledge her concerns, and put the child's life at risk." A spark of indignation flickered inside Jackson. He took a slow breath, determined not to let anger get the better of him. "Officer, I have the correct fence height, a self-latching gate, clearly marked depth indicators, and a warning sign posted. There's no part of this yard that suggests it's public property. If Adele's child was unsupervised, that's her responsibility, not mine." Reynolds paused in his note-taking. "We understand. However, we need to verify the facts. We also have to look into the claim of reckless endangerment. It's a serious accusation, and we're obliged to follow up on it." The words made Jackson's heart pound faster. "Am I under arrest?" he asked quietly, afraid to hear the answer. Greenwood shook his head. "Not at this moment. But we do need you to stay put while we gather information. Our next step is to contact Adele and hear her side." He gestured to his partner, who walked back out the gate to make a phone call. "In the meantime, we'll need to get some details from you." Jackson nodded, swallowing hard. Unnerved as he was, he knew he had to remain calm and cooperate. Whatever Adele had told the police, he needed to refute it with facts and documentation. He glanced at the shimmering water of his pool, the once inviting surface now tinged with the looming threat of legal trouble. Officer Greenwood's questions came rapid fire, leaving Jackson with barely enough time to gather his thoughts. Despite having done nothing but mind his own business until Adele's intrusion, he found himself defending every choice he had made regarding his backyard. The conversation began with routine details. His full name, address, and the circumstances of the pool's installation, but soon shifted to more probing inquiries about liability and safety measures. "How long have you had this pool, Mr. Browning?" Greenwood asked, pen poised over his notepad. Jackson squared his shoulders, trying not to let his apprehension show. "Just over 2 years," he said. "I hired a reputable contractor, got all the necessary permits from the city, and passed every inspection. It's never caused a problem before." Greenwood nodded and jotted down the response. "And you mentioned you keep the gate locked. Did you check it earlier today before these individuals arrived?" A pang of guilt tugged at Jackson, even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. Yes, officer, I always do. Sometimes, I step outside just to double-check the latch because I'm aware of the importance of pool safety. His tone turned a bit defensive as he added, I have young nieces and nephews who visit occasionally. I would never leave this pool unsecured. Officer Reynolds, who had returned from his phone call with Adele, joined the conversation. His expression was stony as he consulted his own notes. Adele claims her son, Colton, slipped and nearly fell into the deep end. She says you witnessed the incident and did nothing to assist. Jackson's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. That's completely false. I was sitting over there, he pointed to the chaise lounge chair, and only got up when I heard them talking. The kid was never in the water, not even close. She started shouting at me, accusing me of having a dangerous setup. Greenwood cleared his throat. Regardless, Adele is pressing charges of reckless endangerment. She claims you created hazardous conditions and willfully ignored the risk to her child. For a moment, it felt as though the ground had shifted under Jackson's feet. He took a slow breath, trying to keep his voice level. With all due respect, that's absurd. This is my property, with all proper precautions. If they came in on their own and didn't supervise the boy, how is that my fault? Reynolds pursed his lips. We're not here to place blame just yet. We have to investigate fully. But if she insists her child was nearly harmed, that complaint has to be taken seriously. Jackson's mind raced, recalling the countless news stories he had read about people being unfairly targeted or misunderstood by the authorities. He sensed the weight of suspicion pressing down on him, despite every logical argument he could muster. I understand, he replied, though his stomach churned. Greenwood stepped away to speak into his radio, briefly updating the station on the situation. Reynolds busied himself by examining the fence, the signage, and the pool's perimeter. After a few tense minutes, Greenwood returned. We've contacted Adele to gather more details. She's given us a statement, and it differs significantly from yours. Jackson tried to steel himself, preparing for the worst. And what happens now? He asked, trying to sound calm but hearing the tremor in his own voice. Greenwood exhaled, looking somewhat sympathetic. We need to follow protocol. Your best bet is to cooperate fully. If you have documents proving the pool was installed lawfully, that would help. We're also going to talk to neighbors to see if they witnessed anything. A flicker of hope stirred within Jackson. His next-door neighbor, Mr. Chapman, was often in his backyard tinkering with his grill or working on his vintage car. Perhaps Chapman saw or heard something. I'll gather whatever documents you need, Jackson said, relief mingling with uncertainty. That's good, Greenwood replied, because right now, we're stuck in a situation where someone claims you put a child at risk. Even if you didn't, we have to do our due diligence. Jackson glanced around his yard, which now felt more like the scene of a crime than a peaceful retreat. How quickly everything had changed. He knew that Adele's accusations were baseless, but he also understood the unpredictability of legal processes. There was no guarantee that logic alone would clear his name. Reynolds joined them again. I spoke with Adele a second time. She insists you verbally threatened her when she asked you to fix the pool. Did you make any sort of statement that could be interpreted as a threat? Jackson shook his head, exasperated. Absolutely not. I asked her to leave because she was trespassing. If anything, she threatened me, claiming I'd be sorry if I didn't make the pool shallower. Greenwood jotted down more notes. That's something we'll definitely follow up on, he said, his tone professional yet non-committal. All right, Reynolds interjected, we've got enough for now. We'll have to file a report. I suggest you gather any evidence proving your compliance with safety codes, inspection certificates, receipts, anything that validates the measures you've taken. Then, be prepared in case this becomes a legal matter. Jackson nodded, his chest heavy with apprehension. The officers took a few photos of the pool and the signage, then stepped away to speak privately, their hushed voices punctuating the tension. After what felt like an eternity, Greenwood turned back to Jackson. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Browning. For now, we suggest you secure the gate more thoroughly. Try to avoid any direct confrontation with Adele if you see her again." As the officers left, Jackson found himself trembling with a potent mix of anger and fear. He had done everything right, or so he believed. Yet, somehow, he stood on the brink of a legal battle he never asked for. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the shimmering water. That day, his backyard no longer felt like the private paradise he cherished. Instead, it seemed to be the stage for a conflict that was only just beginning. The sun had dipped noticeably by the time Jackson finished gathering every piece of evidence he could find regarding the construction and safety compliance of his pool. With shaking hands, he rifled through a metal filing cabinet in his study, pulling out permits, inspection reports, and receipts. Each document represented a small piece of reassurance that he had followed the rules. Still, despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake a growing unease. What if Adele's accusations overshadowed the facts? Once he was satisfied he had everything in order, Jackson returned to the backyard, as though seeing it anew. The fading light painted the water a deep blue, almost black, and he noticed how the lengthening shadows made the space look somewhat ominous. In broad daylight, the pool was an oasis. At dusk, under the weight of recent events, it felt like a stage for potential calamity. He walked the perimeter, testing the gate latch, examining the fence height, and surveying each posted sign. Everything was exactly as required, just as he had promised the city inspector 2 years earlier. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from Marcus Holloway, a close friend who lived only a few blocks away. "Heard something went down at your place. You okay?" The message read. Jackson exhaled slowly, realizing he hadn't told anyone about the situation yet. He typed a brief reply, explaining that he might need a witness if this turned into a legal matter. Marcus, known for his unwavering support, responded with a phone call within seconds. "You sound tense," Marcus commented after Jackson recounted the day's events. "Listen, you did everything by the book, right? You have the documentation?" "Yeah," Jackson replied, pacing restlessly near the hedge. "But it's not that simple. She's already convinced the police that I'm at fault. They said they have to consider reckless endangerment because she claims her son almost drowned. You know how these things can escalate." Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's serious. But look, if you need an extra pair of eyes, maybe I can look over your paperwork. I've got some experience with local ordinances. Remember that time the homeowners association tried to fine me for planting the wrong type of tree? If this goes to court, you'll need all your ducks in a row." "That'd be great," Jackson said, feeling a small wave of relief. "Honestly, I don't know what her game is. It's like she's determined to blame me for something that never happened." "Sometimes people are just looking for a scapegoat," Marcus replied. "Or maybe she's got some other motive. Don't let your guard down." After hanging up, Jackson secured the gate with an additional padlock he had found in his garage. He tested the latch again, giving it a firm tug that reassured him it would not open easily. Yet, no matter how many locks he installed, he couldn't lock out the anxiety gnawing at the back of his mind. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. He kept replaying Adele's visit and the subsequent arrival of the officers over and over. Each time, he scrutinized the details, wondering if he had said or done something that could be twisted into a sign of guilt. Her accusation, reckless endangerment, felt like a heavy weight on his chest, all the more suffocating because he believed it to be completely unfounded. When the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, he rose from his bed, uncharacteristically early. He decided to start his day by adding more explicit warning signs around the pool area. With a roll of bright reflective tape and a stencil kit, he carefully wrote out additional alerts: deep water, 6 feet, authorized persons only, and gate must remain locked. Even if the law only required a single sign, Jackson figured it couldn't hurt to demonstrate an abundance of caution. Around mid-morning, he heard the rumble of an engine outside. Peeking through his front window, he spotted a police cruiser parked along the curb. His stomach flipped. He forced himself to stay calm, stepping outside to meet the officers before they could knock. This time, it was Officer Greenwood and a different partner, Officer Leclerc. Greenwood inclined his head in greeting. "Mr. Browning, we're here to follow up." "Of course," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have the paperwork you asked for." He invited them in, leading them to the kitchen table where he had organized a neat folder of documents. Greenwood flipped through the pages. Permit for pool construction, check. Inspection certificate, check. Signed statement from the contractor verifying the fencing meets local height requirements, check. It looks good on paper. Jackson swallowed hard. "I hope it's enough to clear this up." Adele's story, what did she say, exactly? He tried not to sound too desperate, but anxiety tinged his every word. Greenwood exchanged a brief glance with Leclerc before responding. "She insists that your pool design is inherently dangerous, claiming there's inadequate safety gear. She also mentioned she tried to talk to you about it, but you supposedly became hostile." "That's not true," Jackson said, frustration spilling over. "I told her." Greenwood held up a hand. "I understand. We're not making any judgments right now. However, she's pressing ahead with the claim. We're required to do a thorough inspection of your yard, not just the pool, to see if anything else might factor into the alleged hazard." Jackson felt his pulse quicken. "An inspection? Like, an official one?" "Yes," Greenwood replied. "We'll document the findings in our report, and the district attorney's office will decide if there's enough to move forward with any charges." The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on Jackson from all sides. He guided the officers outside, showing them the fresh signs and the new padlock. They took notes, snapped pictures, and measured fence heights. Every time they whispered to each other, Jackson's nerves jangled. He wanted them to see that he was not just innocent, but diligent in maintaining a safe environment. Eventually, Greenwood looked up from his notepad, a slight frown on his face. "Everything appears to comply with local codes," he said, "but we're still obligated to complete our investigation. The allegations alone give us reason to keep this open for now." Jackson's heart sank. Even though the officers acknowledged his efforts, the specter of a formal charge still lingered. He thanked them for their time, doing his best to remain polite and cooperative. As they left, Greenwood paused at the gate, looking at Jackson as if to offer a small measure of reassurance. "Keep all of this handy," he said, gesturing to the folder of documents. "It might be a process, but evidence like this usually helps." When the cruiser finally pulled away, Jackson felt caught in limbo, half relieved that the inspection had gone smoothly, half terrified that Adele's accusations were pushing him down a path he had no desire to walk. Less than an hour after the officers departed, Jackson's phone buzzed with a call from the police station. The voice on the other end was firm but polite, instructing him to come down for further questioning regarding Adele's claim. A cold sense of dread gripped him. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, false testimonies, lawsuits, perhaps even a smear campaign painting him as negligent or worse. Yet he knew ignoring the summons would only complicate matters. After phoning Marcus for moral support, Jackson drove to the local police precinct, a modest beige building with a small parking lot out front. As he entered through the heavy glass doors, he noticed how every eye seemed to swivel in his direction, as though he were already a suspect. An officer at the reception desk directed him to a corridor on the left, telling him to wait in interview room B. The space was cramped, with plain white walls and a single fluorescent light that cast a harsh glare. Jackson took a seat at a metal table, nerves wound tight. He glanced around, spotting a small camera mounted in the corner. The awareness that he was being recorded only added to his discomfort. A few minutes later, Officer Greenwood stepped in with a folder under his arm. He was accompanied by another detective, a tall, imposing figure with a no-nonsense demeanor. They introduced themselves briefly. The detective's name was Chandler. Chandler offered a curt nod before sitting across from Jackson, opening a slim laptop. Greenwood took a seat to the side, pen and notepad in hand. "So," Chandler began, his voice measured, "we have some accusations regarding a child's near drowning in your pool. We'd like you to clarify your side of the story once again." Jackson steadied himself. He repeated the events as he recalled them, coming home tired, planning to relax by the pool, hearing the gate open, finding Adele and Colton inside, and the confrontation that ensued. He emphasized the point about his posted signs and locked gate, explaining once more how Adele's sudden appearance had blindsided him. As he spoke, Chandler's expression remained impassive. He typed notes without any reaction, while Greenwood occasionally scribbled something. "Tell me," Chandler said at one point, "why do you think Adele has singled you out? Do you have any prior relationship or conflict with her?" Jackson shook his head. "I've never seen her before that day. She's not one of my neighbors, or at least I've never run into her." A twinge of frustration seeped into his voice. "She claimed I was being negligent, but honestly, officer, I suspect she might be looking for someone to blame. Or maybe looking for a lawsuit." A brief flicker of interest lit Chandler's eyes. "A lawsuit, huh? That's a strong accusation." "Well," Jackson continued, choosing his words carefully, "I can't say for sure. But her behavior was very aggressive, like she was trying to provoke me. When I refused her demands to alter the pool, she threatened to call the police." Chandler leaned back in his chair, fingertips drumming lightly on the table. "Do you recall the exact words she used?" Jackson sighed. "Something along the lines of, 'You'll be sorry you messed with me.' She also accused me of not caring if her child drowned. None of that makes any sense, because her son was never in actual danger." The detective nodded, jotting something down. "We've reached out to a few neighbors for corroboration. It seems no one witnessed the confrontation directly, though one neighbor heard raised voices. Probably Mr. Chapman," Jackson said. "He's usually in his backyard. He might have heard Adele yelling, but I doubt he saw what actually happened." Greenwood cleared his throat. "We're trying to sort out the conflicting statements. Adele asserts that you watched her son struggle in the pool and did nothing." "That's a flat-out lie," Jackson retorted, unable to contain a surge of indignation. "Colton wasn't even wet." Chandler's gaze rested on Jackson's face, studying him. "All right. We'll keep that in mind. However, I have to inform you that, based on her complaint, there's a possibility we may file charges. You're not under arrest, but you are a person of interest in this case." Jackson felt his stomach drop, a hollow pit opening inside him. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "What can I do?" "Cooperate," Chandler said simply. "Show us every piece of evidence you have, maintain a calm demeanor, and refrain from any contact with Adele or her child unless it's arranged through legal channels. If there's more to this story, we'll find out." At that moment, the door opened, and an officer gestured for Chandler to step outside. Greenwood followed, leaving Jackson alone in the drab room. Seconds stretched into minutes, each tick of the clock echoing loudly in his mind. He pictured his backyard again, the place that had once been his refuge, now transformed into a battleground of allegations. Eventually, Greenwood returned, his expression a touch softer than before. "We need to process some paperwork," he explained. "In the meantime, please wait in the main lobby. Detective Chandler will talk to you again if necessary." Jackson nodded mutely, rising from the chair. His heart pounded in his ears, and a swirling blend of anger and helplessness coursed through him. He understood the officers had to do their jobs, but Adele's story felt like a malicious fabrication designed to entrap him. In the lobby, he found a seat near a window, hoping the view of passing cars and pedestrians might calm his nerves. Instead, he felt the sting of reality sink deeper. He was on the brink of a criminal charge, all because someone he'd never met decided to blame him for an incident that never happened. During this interminable wait, his phone vibrated. Checking the screen, he saw a message from Marcus offering reassurance and asking for updates. Jackson typed back a quick reply, managing a faint smile at his friend's unwavering support. Moments later, a second text came in, this time from an unfamiliar number, introducing themselves as Irene Watts, a defense attorney recommended by Marcus. "He told me your situation. Let's talk," the text read. Before he could type a response, Greenwood emerged once again, motioning him over to the desk. The officer handed Jackson several forms, explaining that they would contact him for any further inquiries or if a court date was set. Though relieved to be leaving without handcuffs on his wrists, Jackson's heart remained heavy with the realization that this ordeal was far from over. He exited the station into the bright afternoon sun, squinting at the glare. The same city streets that once felt familiar now seemed fraught with potential judgment. He climbed into his car, hands shaking on the steering wheel, and realized that he would need more than just facts on his side. He would need a good lawyer, a firm resolve, and perhaps a bit of luck to navigate the storm that Adele had unleashed. That evening, Jackson sat at his dining room table surrounded by a small mountain of paperwork. Manila folders and loose sheets formed uneven piles, illuminated by the single overhead light. Legal terms like negligence, trespassing, and liability jumped out from various statutes and online printouts. Only hours earlier, he had been interviewed at the police station, a surreal experience that left him feeling both vulnerable and determined to prove his innocence. His phone chimed, alerting him to a text from Irene Watts, the attorney recommended by Marcus. "Can we schedule a call tonight?" It read. Jackson immediately replied affirmatively, eager for guidance. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with the incoming call. Irene's voice was calm yet focused, exuding the kind of confidence Jackson desperately needed. After a brief introduction, he launched into a detailed account of the events, from the moment Adele and Colton appeared in his yard to the ominous conversation at the police station. Irene listened intently, interjecting only to clarify specifics. When Jackson finished, Irene paused for a moment. "This is quite a situation," she said, her tone measured. "First things first, I need a full timeline of what happened, plus any evidence you have, permits, inspection certificates, photos of your property, any messages or calls from Adele or the police. I'll also need the names of potential witnesses." Jackson scanned the scattered paperwork. "I have all of that in front of me. And I'm hoping Mr. Chapman, my neighbor, might confirm parts of my story." He heard the commotion, at least. "That's a start," Irene replied. "We'll want to secure statements from as many reliable witnesses as possible. Even if they didn't see the actual confrontation, they might attest to your character or the usual condition of your property. A negative witness, someone who can testify that they didn't hear or see anything suspicious, can also be useful, as it pokes holes in Adele's narrative." Jackson nodded to himself, appreciating her thorough approach. "The officers did a preliminary inspection," he said. "They seem to acknowledge my pool meets local codes, but the investigation is still ongoing." "That's important," Irene agreed. "We'll request the official report as soon as it's filed. In the meantime, avoid any direct communication with Adele, especially if she tries to reach out. We don't want anything misconstrued or used against you." For the first time all day, Jackson felt a glimmer of hope. He thanked Irene, who promised to draw up a more concrete plan after reviewing his documents. They scheduled an in-person meeting for the following week, leaving Jackson both anxious and grateful to have someone who knew the legal ropes on his side. After the call, he couldn't sleep. Instead, he found himself compulsively rechecking the padlock on the gate, the signage, and every inch of his fence, as though fortifying a castle. It was well after midnight when he finally sat down in front of his computer, curiosity driving him to learn more about Adele. He had her first name, but no surname, yet an odd sense of unease told him there might be more to her sudden aggression. People didn't usually barge into someone's backyard without a hidden motive. He started with local community forums and social media groups, typing in details about suspicious behavior or heated pool-related disputes. His search yielded nothing concrete, but Jackson persisted, scanning threads about neighborhood incidents, warnings of local scammers, and any mention of a woman named Adele. As the hours dragged on, his eyes felt grainy, and frustration threatened to overshadow his curiosity. Finally, in a desperate attempt, he scrolled through the local online newspaper archives. While searching for references to unfounded complaints and pool safety disputes, a small article headline caught his eye: Woman accuses homeowner of hazardous conditions, investigation ongoing. The piece was from a year ago, not too far from Jackson's neighborhood. The woman's name wasn't listed, but the story recounted how she had blamed a homeowner for alleged safety hazards, prompting a wave of legal red tape. Ultimately, the homeowner was cleared, but not before enduring months of stress and financial strain. Could this be Adele? Jackson wondered aloud. His heart pounded at the possibility. If so, it suggested a pattern, a person who might target homeowners and spin a narrative of danger or neglect, all to push for a settlement or recognition. The article ended with a note that the accuser had gone quiet when questioned further by reporters. No charges were filed against her for making false claims. He saved the article, determined to show it to Irene later. Then he forced himself to log off and try to rest. That night, sleep came in restless fragments, peppered with images of gates swinging open and accusing voices echoing in his mind. The next day, Jackson followed Irene's recommendation to the letter. He reached out to potential witnesses, asking if they had seen or heard anything unusual around the time of Adele's intrusion. As expected, Mr. Chapman recalled hearing a woman shouting but admitted he couldn't see over the fence well enough to identify her or the child. Another neighbor, Ms. Carter, stated she had walked her dog down the sidewalk, noting a tense argument in someone's backyard but hadn't intervened. None of these testimonies felt like a smoking gun, but they supported Jackson's timeline. If nothing else, it established that Adele's story, particularly the claim that Colton nearly drowned, didn't align with the auditory cues heard by neighbors. There had been shouting, but no splashing or cries for help that one might associate with a genuine near-drowning. As the hours passed, Jackson began to feel the dull ache of mental exhaustion. The situation seemed to demand he either devote every waking moment to mounting a defense or risk being blindsided by Adele's next move. And with each step forward, each new document or witness statement, he found himself grappling with unrelenting questions: who was Adele, really, and why was she doing this? By evening, he called Marcus to update him on the developments. His friend suggested they meet up for coffee to strategize. "Let's see if we can find more concrete info on Adele," Marcus insisted. "Maybe cross-reference property records or something. If she's filed similar claims before, it might be on public record." Jackson hesitated, torn between wanting to uncover the truth and feeling uneasy about prying into someone's personal life. But he reminded himself that he had every right to protect his own interests, especially when being accused of such a serious offense. He agreed to meet Marcus at a local cafe the next morning. Hanging up the phone, Jackson gazed out the window at his yard, bathed in the soft glow of porch lights. His once beloved sanctuary felt like a constant reminder of turmoil. "I need this to end," he thought wearily. Then he squared his shoulders, steeling himself for whatever revelations or confrontations lay ahead. The next morning, Jackson and Marcus sat at a small table in Harvest Brew Cafe, each nursing a cup of black coffee that seemed to mirror the tension in the air. Between them lay an open laptop, reflecting determined faces back at them. Marcus navigated through public records websites, scanning property deeds, court filings, and any other tidbits that might shed light on Adele's background. "So far, nothing obvious," Marcus muttered, clicking through another set of documents. "No major civil cases under the name Adele for this county, at least not that I can find." Jackson tapped the table anxiously. "What if she's using an alias or something? I read that article about a woman who pulled a similar stunt not too long ago, but there was no name mentioned." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Some folks are careful to avoid leaving a digital footprint. Still, there's always something." He paused for a moment, then leaned closer to the screen. "Hold on. Here's a lawsuit from about 6 months ago. Someone named R. Pierce accused a homeowner of unsafe conditions involving a walkway. She dropped the lawsuit after a counterclaim for trespassing. Could that be her? Jackson peered at the text, excitement mounting. It's possible, he said, scanning the details. The plaintiff described an allegedly dangerous walkway, but the defendant argued she had trespassed at night. That scenario isn't too far off from my situation. But I can't be sure. Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. Either way, it shows a pattern. This woman, if it is the same person, seems to pick fights with homeowners, claims something is dangerous, and then tries to hold them responsible. When the homeowner pushes back, she bails out. Jackson's pulse quickened. That's enough for suspicion, at least. I'll bring this up to Irene. Maybe she can contact the attorney who handled that case. They continued digging for another hour, eventually compiling a brief list of questionable cases, all with minimal details but strikingly similar allegations. Whether or not Adele was directly involved, it was enough to spark hope that Jackson could disprove her claims by highlighting a potential history of opportunistic accusations. Before parting ways, Marcus offered Jackson a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Stay strong," he said. "We're piecing this together." She picked the wrong guy to mess with. Jackson managed a small smile. "Thanks. I don't know what I'd do without your help. Let's see how Irene can use this. If Adele really is some sort of scammer, the truth has to come out." As he drove home, Jackson's mind spun with possibilities. Though the battle was far from won, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. The uneasy anxiety that had weighed him down seemed to lessen, replaced by determination to stand up for himself, and, he realized, for anyone else who might have been unfairly targeted by Adele's schemes. Over the following days, Jackson and his attorney, Irene Watts, worked tirelessly to compile an airtight defense. Irene presented the evidence of Adele's suspicious pattern, gathered through Jackson and Marcus's research, to the investigating officers. She also filed a formal request with the district attorney's office to review any past complaints Adele might have lodged. As it turned out, multiple records pointed to Adele, under various last names, making similar claims in different neighborhoods. The break came when the police, acting on Irene's submissions, began their own deeper investigation into Adele's background. They uncovered instances of her harassing homeowners, allegedly hoping to settle out of court for quick payouts. One homeowner recounted how Adele had threatened a lawsuit for an uneven driveway until the property owner's insurer refused to budge. Though she often dropped cases at the first sign of solid opposition, this time she had gone a step further by involving a child. Faced with mounting evidence, the district attorney's office issued a warrant for Adele's arrest on charges of fraud and child endangerment. Her using Colton in staged incidents for monetary gain was considered especially egregious. Her record revealed she had a history of manipulating situations to her advantage, sometimes targeting individuals who lacked resources or legal know-how. The day Jackson got the call from Irene confirming Adele's arrest felt surreal. A wave of relief mingled with lingering disbelief washed over him. Standing on his porch, phone in hand, he gazed into his once troubled backyard, the pool sparkling in the sun like a promise that justice could prevail. In the end, no charges were filed against Jackson. Instead, the authorities recognized him as a victim of attempted extortion. The community, upon learning the truth, rallied around him, offering apologies for the suspicion he had faced. He began to receive messages of support from neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers who had read about the ordeal in local news outlets. With Adele no longer free to spin her false narratives, Jackson finally felt a burden lifting. His backyard, once a battleground of accusations, returned to being a peaceful retreat where he could read, lounge in the water, and feel safe in his own space. Glancing at the sturdy fence and the newly fortified gate, he allowed himself a small smile. The path to vindication had been rocky, but he had proven his innocence. In that moment, Jackson vowed to use his experience to advocate for stronger protections against fraudulent claims, especially those that weaponized children in the process. Though the ordeal had been harrowing, it had also strengthened his resolve, turning him into a quiet but determined champion for justice. After a lengthy investigation and courtroom drama, the tide finally turned in Jackson Browning's favor. With the mounting evidence meticulously compiled by his attorney, Irene Watts, and the concerted efforts of local law enforcement, Adele's fraudulent scheme unraveled. The court found her guilty of fraud and child endangerment for repeatedly staging dangerous situations to coerce unwarranted settlements. In a decisive verdict, she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a sentence that served as a stern warning to anyone attempting to manipulate the legal system for personal gain. In the aftermath of the trial, Jackson's own legal charges were promptly dropped. The district attorney's office, impressed by the solid evidence proving that his private swimming pool complied fully with local safety regulations, confirmed that he had done nothing wrong. Relief washed over him as the heavy burden of suspicion lifted. Neighbors and community members, who had initially been swayed by the misleading allegations, soon recognized the truth of his integrity. Local media began to share his side of the story, and his case became a beacon of justice in a system too often skewed by unfounded claims. As news of Adele's conviction spread throughout the community, Jackson noticed an outpouring of support from his fellow residents. People he had never met reached out with messages of encouragement and admiration for his resilience. The support wasn't limited to individual commendations. Community groups organized town hall meetings to discuss better safeguards against fraudulent accusations. Jackson's ordeal had struck a chord, inspiring many to call for fairer treatment of citizens and more rigorous checks on baseless legal claims. Motivated by the injustice he had narrowly escaped, Jackson soon found himself emerging as a local advocate for fairness and racial justice. His experience, marred by the insinuations of negligence and the specter of a wrongful accusation, had awakened in him a desire to champion the rights of those who might otherwise be unfairly targeted. He began speaking at community gatherings, sharing his story and urging others to demand accountability from both law enforcement and local government. His words resonated, and gradually, Jackson became a trusted voice for reform. In his heartfelt speeches, Jackson emphasized that his case was not just about a single pool or one unfounded allegation. It was a reminder of the importance of due process, the necessity of evidence over emotion, and the need for communities to stand up against those who would misuse the law for personal vendettas. With each public appearance, he advocated for changes in how accusations were handled, particularly those that exploited the vulnerabilities of minority communities. In time, Jackson Browning's transformation from a private homeowner to a community leader became emblematic of a broader movement toward justice and equality. His resilience in the face of adversity not only restored his reputation but also served as a catalyst for systemic change. The courtroom victory and subsequent community support affirmed that, when truth prevails, even the most malicious plots can be dismantled. In the weeks following the resolution of the legal battle, Jackson found himself embracing a renewed sense of calm and reflection. His once turbulent backyard, which had been the scene of conflict and anxiety, now radiated tranquility as the gentle ripple of his private swimming pool mirrored his inner peace. Jackson sat on his favorite chaise lounge during the golden hours of early evening, allowing the fading light to soothe the scars of the ordeal. He often recalled the turbulent moments when he had been thrust into a legal nightmare by Adele's false claims. Now, with the conviction of his accuser and his own name exonerated, he could finally focus on the positive outcomes that had emerged from the chaos. The experience had not only cleared his record but had also transformed him into a passionate advocate for justice, particularly in matters concerning the mistreatment of minority individuals. This transformation brought a profound sense of purpose that Jackson hadn't anticipated. One aspect of the resolution that brought him particular solace was the story of a neglected child, whose life had been inadvertently impacted by the entire debacle. During the investigation, it came to light that Colton, the young boy involved in the incident, had been placed into temporary foster care as a result of the chaos. However, thanks to the revelations of Adele's manipulative practices, the foster system intervened, ensuring that Colton was now in a safer and more nurturing environment. Jackson felt a deep sense of relief knowing that the chain of events had ultimately led to a positive change for the child, who now had a chance at a better future. Jackson's reflection on these events was quiet and introspective. He recognized that although the ordeal had been stressful and life-altering, it had also given him the strength to stand up for what was right. His fight was not just about clearing his name, it was about protecting his community from those who sought to exploit vulnerabilities for personal gain. Every letter of the court documents and every testimonial that helped him win the case became symbols of his commitment to fairness and accountability. In his quieter moments, Jackson began documenting his experiences. He penned thoughtful essays on the importance of community vigilance and the need for robust legal safeguards against fraudulent claims. His writings resonated with many, sparking discussions at local events and online forums. Through these reflections, he felt a profound connection to a larger movement toward social justice, a movement that aimed to ensure that no one would ever be falsely accused or forced into a battle they did not deserve. As he continued to reflect on his journey, Jackson embraced the notion that every hardship could be a stepping stone toward a more compassionate and just society. His backyard, once a symbol of isolation and conflict, had transformed into a haven of hope, a reminder that truth and perseverance could indeed pave the way for renewal and progress. Hey everyone! If you found this story powerful and meaningful, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, ringing the bell to never miss our thought-provoking content. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, educate, and challenge perspectives. Thank you for being part of this journey.